Hello everyone, my name is Samantha Marshall and today I'm going to read to you chapter 1 of my novella Headless, which will be appearing in A Perfectly Paranormal Halloween, which is due out on the 18th of October, which is super close now. Unless of course you're watching this retrospectively, in which case... Alright, so you're going to have to bear with me. I don't have a paperback copy yet, so I'm going to be reading this with my iPad. And I am going to be doing it on my lap. So here we go. So this novella is titled Headless, and chapter 1 is called Begin As You Mean to Go On. Trees loomed ahead, and Devlin's fingers tightened on the wheel as the RV bumped off the road and onto the grass. Despite reading the operations manual from cover to cover several times, in the heat of the moment he couldn't remember which of the various pedals was for acceleration, braking, or, in a twist of creative inspiration he'd never understand, the built-in drinking spout which jettisoned water in case of an unreasonable thirst. He stomped down hard with his left foot and yelped as said water splashed across his chest. Not that one, clearly. And those evergreens really did look quite menacing now that he was close enough to make out individual branches. Shifting his foot to the right, Devlin stomped again, and the RV jerked to a halt, momentum throwing him against the dish-like centre of the steering wheel, hard enough to set the horn blaring. A sound that cut off as the vehicle rocked hard on its axle, returning his body to the seat amidst a symphony of clanging pots, clattering crockery, and Bailey's indignant shriek. "My pardon," he called, offering a sheepish grin. Bailey glared from where she now lay upside down on the floor after tumbling off the RV's bed, blankets tangled around her legs. Devlin sighed, pushing himself upright. Stopping is more complicated than it at first appears. Bailey curled a lip. "Are you injured?" Devlin tried to peer down the length of the vehicle, but his head had lodged at an awkward angle on the dash. When Bailey didn't answer, he braced against the steering wheel and leaned over until he could tangle his fingers in his own hair. Ignoring the sharp tug against his scalp, he positioned his head under one arm and levered out of the driver's seat. Perusing one's environment from one's own armpit had taken some getting used to and a revised hygiene routine, but after more centuries than he dared record, Devlin had become accustomed to it. He'd become accustomed to a lot of things, the sort of things he'd never imagined having to become accustomed to until his head was permanently separated from his body. Such was the nature of being cursed. "Hold still a moment, or you'll make it worse." Devlin sat his head on a stack of books so that he could see both his body and Bailey, then set about disentangling her legs from the blanket and getting her back onto the bed without either of them tripping over one another. That trick alone had taken him decades to perfect, though perfection really was in the eye of the beholder, and Bailey wasn't the kind to be impressed when one poked her in said eye because he'd placed his head at a strange angle and couldn't quite see her face. He took a half step back from the bed. "Better now?" Bailey narrowed her eyes at him. "I'll take that as a yes. Will you accompany me on my errand, or am I going alone?" Her eyes narrowed further until her irises were little more than baleful slits. "Alone it is." Devlin straightened the clothes he'd obtained at their previous rest stop. He was still becoming used to modern clothing, but the tight denim he'd acquired felt somewhat, if not exactly, like his old leather breeches, and the black t-shirt, though a little snug, was reminiscent of the linen shirts he'd once worn beneath his tunic. Since the shop owners had screamed and fled when he'd accidentally knocked his head off on a low-hanging display, Devlin hadn't been able to ask about armour, or even pay for his items, but he'd found a stand of leather jackets that, whilst their protective value appeared doubtful, were lined with fleece and had a nice high collar. Devlin picked up the roll of flexible, adhesive cloth he'd discovered in the RV's bathing room and examined the box. This Kinesio tape claims maximum adhesion and minimal skin irritation, yet my head still fell off. Maybe I didn't use enough? Bailey rolled over to stare at the wall. I apologised for the sudden stop, Devlin grumbled, pulling the roll of tape from the box. It was a brilliant lime green with a removable backing protecting the sticky side. I cannot do this alone, Bailey. Please. She heaved a dramatic sigh, then shuffled to the edge of the bed and picked his head up by the hair. While Devlin faced the mirrored closet door, Bailey held his head on top of his neck so that he could secure it in place with the tape. Is it on straight? Bailey eyed him up and down, then jerked her chin in a nod and returned to the bed. Are you going to cease talking to me for the rest of the day? Devlin snipped off several long lengths of tape and began wrapping the stuff around his neck as best he could. When he had a band as wide as his 4 fingers, he stopped and jumped up and down in place. I'm far more hopeful about this excessive amount of tape. My head feels almost solid. Bailey grunted, but some of the tension eased from her shoulders. Do you think I should take my sword? Devlin twisted to look out of one of the RV's windows, eyeing the township beyond. Nobody in this new, modern world carried swords, and the few times he'd tried, he'd had a less than ideal reception. He clicked his tongue against his teeth. No sword. Bailey sniggered. I failed to see the joke, Devlin snapped, snatching his leather jacket from the hook on the back of the door. You're not the one facing a journey without her sword strapped in place atop her armour. He drew his jacket on, then picked up a striped black and grey scarf and wound it around his neck to hide the tape. Tucking the ends of the scarf into themselves, Devlin fastened the jacket via the unusual but convenient contraption he'd learned was called a zipper, and held his arms out for inspection. Well? Bailey's eyes drifted unerringly to his hair, long enough that one of them could grab it in order to carry his head around. At the current moment, it stuck up at all angles, testament to the fact that they'd both been doing exactly that. Not much I can do, Devlin muttered, trying to fix the unruly mess as best he could. If I comb it, I run the risk of dislodging my head entirely. Bailey's lips pressed together, but laughter shone in her eyes. Devlin grumbled as he stomped back to the front of the RV, snatching the silver key from the ignition and sliding it into his pocket. Defend our home, then, if you're not coming along. Without bothering to wait for her answer, he opened the door and climbed down to the ground. A chill wind swept the grassed area in which he'd parked the vehicle, swirling dust and leaves before it. Devlin was glad of his scarf and jacket as he closed the door of the RV and made his way towards the small cluster of shops on the other side of the road. Clouds hung overhead, dark with the threat of rain, and the early morning saw a thin fog curling against the ground, much like a lazy cat. He risked a glance down at his palms, still bearing the same calluses they had at the moment of his not quite death. Broad hands, flecked with scars he'd earned honourably, or at least that's what he'd thought at the time. Devlin clenched his hands and shoved them in his jacket pockets. His neck itched the further he went, and every curious face that turned his way made him flinch. But nobody screamed or backed away as he rounded the front of the nearest building, following the phantom tug in his chest that had led him on such a wild chase. The shops were clumped together in groups of 2 or 3, with neatly swept front steps and coloured awnings. Gut twisting, Devlin hesitated outside a shop with stylized letters on the door and magical paraphernalia in the windows. If he were to progress further, to reach for the one and only thing that could absolve his many sins, he would have to confront a creature he'd once sworn to hunt and destroy, a creature to whom he now owed a terrible debt. Shame burnt his cheeks as he studied the shiny brass handle before him. Had he really come so far, only to balk now? He thought of all the long, lonely years he and Bailey had been trapped in their secluded hollow and frowned. He owed it to her, to his sins and to himself, to set things right once and for all, to have courage, even in the darkest times. Squaring his shoulders, Devlin opened the door and went in search of a demon. That is the end of chapter 1. So I hope you liked it. I hope you didn't mind my stumbling over the words. That happens sometimes when I'm trying to read out loud. This story was great fun to write, and this anthology was an absolute blast to be in. They always are. This is the second one. If you haven't read the first one, if you're new, if you don't know what's going on, we did a Valentine's themed one, and this one's now a Halloween themed one. And this has been a real joy to write. Also a challenge, writing a story about a character whose head's not attached to his body. If you liked this, then make sure to check out the actual anthology. I'll leave all the links down below. And yeah, get yourself a copy, have a read, have a good day, have a great day, have a spooky day, whatever works for you. And until next time, I'll see you later. Bye.